Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to Hollywood Backlot with Lou and You, a standard production like we used to do before, but this one is with a twist right here. This one is actually filmed in front of a live studio audience, at least for the first 15 minutes. Thank you so much, chat, for joining us here on this very unique presentation of Hollywood Backlot with Lou and You. I guess it's fitting, actually, Lou, now that I think about it, because we're all about the backlot. We're all about taking you behind the scenes. We're all about going behind the camera and seeing what's going on.
Yeah, I've known some people behind the camera that are worth a show all by themselves.
Well, if you guys are watching at home, we talked about the Universal Monsters as part of Epic Universe's unbelievable debut in the Dark Universe new themed land that they're opening up. But I kind of want to go ahead and take this show in a different direction, because I think it was now 2 shows ago that I was really inspired by this. And I was like, I kept thinking about it. And I was like, we got to do a show on this. I want to go ahead and take it back to the old West. From
my favorite place.
Exactly, right? We're moving from the European village to 6 Points, Texas, as part of the Old West. But specifically, I want to eventually get to, obviously, we'll tell the whole history here if we could, but the spaghetti westerns.
Oh, you're talking to the expert,
Okay.
Oh, yeah. There was a time not that long ago where I was working on a deal to actually build a Western-themed, spaghetti Western-influenced theme park, entertainment, for real. I have the drawings, I have the plans, I have everything. Somehow I didn't have the $25 million we were going to start with, but, such is life. Such is life. But
such is life, for sure.
25, 150, I forget how many. It was a lot of money. But
I'm guessing to tell the proper story of the spaghetti westerns, I guess we have to go back
to pre-war Italy.
Right.
And what you have to know is that one of the major economic impacts on the movie business and on business in general of that war, whose combatants shall remain semi-nameless, long before we ever got into it, because it was going on for a couple of years before we ever were dragged into it, kicking and screaming. It meant that a lot of our usual commerce, particularly with Europe and certainly with Japan too, was cut off. A big part of any movie's revenue was not just that it played in America and in Canada and in England, but that it played in Italy and Germany and Hungary and all those other places. Well, suddenly there was a war on and that went away. That was bad for business in Hollywood. But it was also bad for the people who used to love American stuff. Particularly in Italy, Westerns were very, very popular. And suddenly they couldn't get any. And so after the war, there was this huge hunger, but nobody ever thought about, we should make our own, because it was considered the American art form within the larger movie art form. As it happens, there was this guy named Sergio Leone, and his father was an assistant director and production manager. And after World War II, there was a lot of movie making by American companies in Italy, but it was not Westerns. It was sword and sandal movies, as they call them, the Hercules stuff. And his father was a prominent AD on a lot of those movies. And so he had connections with American producers who shot movies over there. And certainly not just those lower end movies, but look at all of the biblical stuff that Cecil B. DeMille did. Anyway, so he became an assistant director also. And he was looking like everybody else for his big way of breaking in as a director, as a guy in charge. And one day, a buddy of his, who was a screenwriter, called him up and said, hey, there's this movie playing in Rome, and you got to see it. Well, what is it? Well, it's a Japanese movie called Yojimbo. And Yojimbo is the first of the wandering samurai movies that was that
kind of like Kurosawa type of films.
Yeah, but the plot was this, what they used to call the lone samurais, because the samurai usually were, the knights of a king or a lord. And there were these guys that were just sort of wandering around, basically guns for hire. Okay, only it was a sword, obviously. And this was a movie where this guy rolls into town and there's these 2 competing criminal families. and they hate each other, and they both want to hire him to kind of change the balance of power. So he works for one for a while and kills the other guys, and he works for the other one for a while, and it goes back and forth. Well, if that sounds familiar, that's a fistful of dollars. And that's why his buddy brought him to see it. He said, look, it's Japanese, but what if we did it as a Western? And the little light went on, and he said, wow, but where do we do it? He said, well, how about Spain? It's cheap there. And the terrain down in the south of Spain is very similar to the Old West. And we could do it cheap and get it done. And they put it together, and they did it. There was no such thing as the so-called spaghetti Westerns until that. And one thing you have to understand about Westerns or any other movies in Italy at that time, they're all dubbed. When I say all dubbed, I don't mean they record them in Italian and then somebody comes in and does the voices in English or German. Because Italy was so small as a budget, a market for movies, they couldn't make a real serious profit just showing them in Italy. And so what they used to do was they would hire actors with some prominence in their own country, whether it was Germany or France or America or England, and they'd put them all in the same movie. And then they would dub it all afterwards. In fact, on the set, they were literally talking to each other in languages the other guy didn't understand in many cases. But then they would dub them into the various languages. And if you had the biggest star in Sweden in your movie, when it went to Sweden, he got above the title as the star. When it came back to Italy, the Italian guy got above the title as the star. And lots of them, the Italians in particular, but also these people from other countries, would take on American-sounding stage names. And because they hoped if they could get it in England, in America or England, that it would seem more like a real Western rather than this quote-unquote fake Western that they made in Spain. So they made the movie. And then they thought, well, who can we get to be in this movie? And at that time, there was a TV show that was beginning to get syndicated in Italy called Rawhide with a young actor named Clint Eastwood. And they knew that in America, the TV production season ran for a certain number of months, and then there was what was called hiatus, when the people in those shows could take other jobs if they could get them. And so they contacted Eastwood, and they gave him an offer for the hiatus to come over and make this Western in Spain and in Rome. That the studio stuff was in Rome. And it was a very low-budget production. So they said, could you bring some things for your costume or whatever? He brought his guns from Rawhide, knowing nobody would miss them during the off-season. He got the famous poncho. It's a Mexican poncho at a place called the Supply Sergeant, which was a surplus store on Hollywood Boulevard. That and the cheroots that he didn't really smoke, but he wanted them because he thought it would give him the right sort of nasty, bitter look on his face all the time. Talk about method acting. Anyway, he came over to Italy. He made the movie. It had a different name when they made it. He got paid, came back to Hollywood, kept working on the TV show. And one day on the set at Warner Brothers, a friend of his calls him over and says, look at this, and gives him variety that says that there's this Italian Western. And that was why he thought he was being shown it. Isn't that something? They're making Westerns. Because he hadn't told anybody about this low-budget piece of nothing. He just did it for the money and came back. And, of course, they'd changed the name from what he knew it as, so he didn't realize it was his movie, and it was burning up the box office all over Europe. And he said, wait a minute, I think I made that movie. Okay? So none of this was a planned, organized, it just happened. It just organically came together. And because it was a hit, other directors over there thought, well, gee, we can go to Spain and shoot a movie too. And meanwhile, they called him back for a second one. And because they had come up with that title of A Fistful of Dollars, they said, okay, we'll call the second one A Few Dollars More. And only when those two movies were done that summer did they open in America, mostly in drive-ins as double features, and kicked butt, made a fortune. And that's when they said, well, we've got to do a third one. And Sergio wanted him to also get some other Hollywood people in it. And they found this guy who everybody knew his face, but nobody really knew him as a great actor, who was already heading for the motion picture home. He was kind of giving it up, named Lee Van Cleef. And they talked him into doing it. And then they needed one more person, and he really wanted a Hollywood star. And they found a way to reach Eli Wallach, who agreed to do it. And they made The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which opened to much bigger attention. And basically, that's what made Clint Eastwood a star. And The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, of course, had a even more American theme than just the West, because it's about the Civil War, kind of in a different way about the ending of the Civil War the way that the movie The Genre Guys just did, The Undefeated with John Wayne and Rock Hudson is. And they made these movies in Spain, partly because of the scenery, but also because Generalissimo Franco had an army for rent. And this movie required a bunch of guys to play Union and Confederate soldiers, and climaxing in this huge scene at a big bridge that they blew up. And why did they want Franco? Because Franco had a bunch of antique weapons. He had old Civil War era Gatling guns and the uniforms. So again, it was a budget thing. But they made the movie. Eastwood has said that he tried to warn Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach about the way they did business over there and how it wasn't quite as safe and as careful as in Hollywood. And for that big bridge scene, Leone wanted them to stand in a certain spot, and Eastwood, who knew better by now, said, no. And he marched them back up about 200 yards away. And sure enough, when they blew up the bridge, they would have been killed because the debris would have fallen on that spot that he wanted them in to frame the shot. Eli Wallach also almost got killed. You might remember in Good, Bad, the Ugly, there's a scene where he's handcuffed, and he wants to cut the chain. So he goes to the railroad track, and he's going to put his two manacled wrists with the chain over the track, so when the train goes by, it'll cut the chain. Thing is, that puts his head pretty darn close to the train. And this old Spanish train they got, which in every other respect looked like American Old West trains, had a feature that was common over there, but American trains didn't have. It had kind of like a running board along the edge of the train. So it meant that the corner of the train that was nearest his head stuck out about 10 to 12 inches more than anybody was expecting. And of course, there's no rehearsal. It's lay down here, put it here, it'll be great. Eli Wallach in his memoirs talks about his head was inches away from being hit by this train going 40 miles an hour down the track. So they were all a little rough and ready. Well, by now, A, everybody was making these spaghetti westerns in Italy on the cheap. B, a lot of American stars were going over to be the figurehead in them. A lot of them actually because remember, westerns were still a big deal on television during their hiatus times. And that's when finally, the studio came to Leone and said, okay, you can make one here and with big stars and for real. And Leone said, oh, that's too bad because I want to do a gangster movie next. I'm not interested in the West anymore. And everything went crazy. And eventually they made a deal where, all right, we'll let you do the gangster movie, but you got to do the Western first, okay? And Leone really wanted a big star. And the one he wanted was Henry Fonda. And thus the beginnings of the most, if you haven't seen it, if you've been scared off by the fact that it's 3 hours long, if you haven't seen the complete movie versus the chopped up shortened versions they did in America because it was 3 hours long, Once Upon a Time in the West is, as I have said, not only, I think, the greatest of all the Westerns, it is one of the best movies ever made. And it stars Charles Bronson and Claudia Cardinale and Jason Robards, and no, not Clint Eastwood, but Henry Fonda. But how he got into it was a little strange. His wife used to read the scripts that were sent for him to tell him which ones she thought he ought to read and consider doing. And one day she comes running in and she says, Hank, you got to do this one. He says, why? What's so special? And she tells him that in his opening scene in the movie, this group of bad guys in those long dusters that all the people in the Leone Westerns wore rides up on this house where there's a young family, and there's 3 kids and the husband, and they're preparing a big party, a feast, because, as it turns out, his mail-order bride, who's coming to replace the mother who died, is supposed to arrive today on the train from New Orleans. Claudia Cardinale will be that character. The bad guys ride in, and they kill it all. I mean, just cold-bloodedly blow their, except the little 10-year-old boy who's standing there just in total shock, who's just seen his father and his 2 sisters gunned down out of nowhere by these shrouded characters on the hill. And they're all standing there looking at this little kid. And one of the henchmen says, well, what are you going to do about the kid, Frank? And we go up and we see, and he says, well, now that you told him my name, and he turns around and there's those baby blue eyes of Hank Fonda's, and he shoots right between the eyes. And his wife said, theaters all around the world are going to have audiences jumping up screaming, holy crap, Henry Fonda just shot that kid. And from there, the story unfolds. As I said, it's a movie, not just a Western. It's about the end of the West because it's about the railroad coming. And when the railroad came, law and order came. And when the railroad came, commerce came and politics and all those things that made the West not the West anymore. And it's just the most wonderful movie. Now, the actual opening scene, which you remember I shared with you, is these three guys at this train station in the middle of nowhere. It's this old platform with one little ticket booth with kind of a conductor guy and a squeaky windmill and a dripping pump and bare, worn to the bone timbers that have been sandblasted by the desert for 20 years. And they're all waiting for the train. No music, just the sound effects of this squeaking windmill. And these three guys, two of whom are Woody Strode and Jack Elam, old friend of mine, once upon a time. And Jack Elam is sitting there, and there's a fly that's flying around his face, and he grabs it in the barrel of his gun and listens to it, and the train pulls up. They're obviously waiting for somebody coming on that train. And it pulls up, and it takes on water, and it drives away. And they didn't see anybody get off, and they're kind of looking at each other. And as the train pulls away, they see the guy did get off, but on the other side. And he says, "Did Frank send you?" And now we know there's a connection, of course, later. But they say, "No, he sent us." And he looks over and he sees their three horses, and he says, "You're one horse short." And Jack says, "No, you're missing one, and no, you're not, because you're not going anywhere. We're going to kill you." And they look at each other, and this guy is playing a harmonica. And this is Charles Bronson. And his character name in the whole movie is just Harmonica. We don't know what his name is. And everybody pulls their gun, and of course, Bronson kills all of them. And that's how that part of the story begins. And each person in this story are individuals who come together for totally random reasons, but it becomes this huge battle between the railroad and the people that have houses that might be in the way. But that's not what it's about. It's about the internal conflict of people who've been either making a living from or being hurt by the fact that they're out there, they're on the moon as far as the rest of the world is concerned. They're in this total, barren, empty universe, and the train is coming, and it's all going to end. And how can you get as much you can get out of it before it does? Anyway, I went on forever, but I only told a little bit of it. Now, the story of the movie is it was a huge, huge hit, so much so that 2.5 years later, it was still playing at a theater in Paris on the Champs-Élysées. And so Sergio Leone came to see it. They had a little event, and all the fans were there, and everybody was happy, except the projectionist, who came down, looked at him, and said, 2.5 years, and it's 3 hours long, and it's so slow, and punched him in the nose. So the movie had its fans and its rivals. And then, of course, Leone made his gangster movie, which the studio thought gangster movies were dead, just like the trouble that they had making The Godfather for that reason. But anyway, he made that. He kind of directed, but officially didn't, a wonderful comedy spaghetti Western, also about the end of the West, also with Henry Fonda, this time as a good guy, called My Name is Nobody. And you should all see that one because it's a blast. And all of these had the amazing music of Ennio Morricone. And I have a player piano. And I have I have the player piano roll of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And if you remember that music, there's these people kind of grunting as part of the music. Rip, all this. The words are transliterated on the piano roll where the lyrics normally go on a piano roll. So you can sit at my piano and play along and grunt along with Ennio Morricone, okay? But anyway, and all of these movies became huge. There was but suddenly it made a whole new career for Lee Van Cleef. And he did some, if you want to go see the ones that are Sabata, where there's 3 or 4 of them. And I'm seeing all the chats, and I see people know and love these. How much impact did sound have on the fact that they had to dub in a different language, certainly. But by the way, that whole thing of them dubbing movies in Italy, they brought back something with Morricone's music in these movies that hadn't been done since the silence. In the days of the silent movies, when there was no soundtrack being recorded, they'd have a string quartet or a band or somebody, or at least a piano player, on the set to play music just on the fly to give the actors the mood of the scene because it wasn't going to go on the soundtrack. There was none. Well, they did this again. Usually, movie scores are written after the fact. And this one, the main themes for each of the characters, and I didn't mention Robards as Cheyenne, who's another wonderful character in this movie. Each of them had their own theme song, just like soundtracks do, but they were playing them on the set so they could get a sense of, the emotion. And somebody's asking another one of Leone's movies, Duck You Sucker, which is a lot of fun. It's not really it's kind of a Western, but it's about Ireland and the Troubles and all of that, with James Coburn and Rod Steiger. And yeah, it's a fun movie. Oh, and somebody mentions that, yes, Once Upon a Time in the West is restored to 4K, and the extras are super. They show you all the places in Spain where they shot the movie, and they go from, here's what it looks like now compared to what it looked like then. And, where there was a gunfight, there's now a gas station. And where there's, Seven Samurai, which was the source of Magnificent Seven. And Captain John D is mentioning that fly. John D, I don't know if you've heard me mention it before, but Jack told me the way they got that fly to stay with him, honey. They put a little drop of honey on his face near his jaw where this fly is crawling around because he's stuck there by honey.
I just love...
I like Westerns. That's probably proof. And of course, there's all the great American Westerns too. But
I love this era. I love this era of just these incredible... I don't know, these really kind of, we talked about subgenres before, but the subgenre of film that came out of Europe, specifically Italy, it's where the name Spaghetti Western comes from.
But obviously, again, had they not become such huge fans of those movies in the years before the war, because that was America, that was as exotic to them, the Old West in America, as the Tarzan movies were about Africa to American audiences in the 1930s, just for one example. It's the joy of something different. Now, there's probably only so many ways you can tell a love story, a revenge story, a good guys versus bad guys story. But you put it in an exotic locale that people are not familiar with, and you suddenly imprint on them what that locale is really like, whether you're accurate or not. I mean, I remember reading a book years ago that was about, in that conflagration in the 40s, a lot of the prisoners we took in Europe from that country over there that shall remain nameless were put in American POW camps in Arizona and Texas and places like that. And it was a novel about these two Army guys that were in that situation. And they were, oh my God, it's the West. Because in Germany, there was an author named Karl, I pronounce it May, but M-A-Y, May, who wrote a series. He was the Zane Grey of 1920s, 30s, 40s Germany. And so they were excited that as prisoners, they were going to be in Texas and Arizona. And, my gosh, we'll get to see Indians and we'll get to, and of course, it was nothing like the Old West in those books. And that was interesting to show wish I knew the name of the book, I would recommend it to you all, but I'm sure it's searchable. Everything is. But it was fun because of their misconceptions of how the real West was, especially in the 40s. It's funny, and yet it just shows you the power that literature, even pulp fiction, if you will, can have on people when they're writing about places. Well, I mean, the real Tatooine isn't like the one in the movies, you know that. But people think it is because they saw the movie. But, Westerns, they're about taking responsibility for that very reason I mentioned about the fact that there was no real law and order, that you can't wait. You can't call the cops and hope they answer within 911 in 20 minutes or something. You got to do it yourself. That was a brief, glimmering moment of a few years in our history. And it's part of what makes America, America. Let's just leave it like that.
I will absolutely say so. There are so many other things I want to talk about, like Ennio's obviously amazing work and his Oscar win. Packet says Metallica uses Ecstasy of Gold in their start of their shows. Yes, they absolutely do, and they have for I think like 30 years now, which is really, really cool trivia. We are going to say goodbye to our studio audience right now because, well, we got to give you something to actually tune in for. Thank you so much for tuning in here. And we'll see you next week on the other side when you actually see the show. Well, no time has passed, obviously, but for now, take care. Continuing on with our talk of this amazing topic right here, I want to talk a little bit about Ennio Morricone, I believe. The amazing composer whose work really spans this gambit of Sergio Leone spaghetti Western films right here. Are there any...
And a lot of other great movies, too. He did more than that, but...
That's true. But I think he's I would say
He
probably
got
most
famous
recognized for those.
Yeah.
Right. Any insights into his amazing work? Because I think those incredible scores like Ecstasy of Gold, which I believe our studio audience actually stated before we signed off with them, was that the lead song to Metallica, to every single concert that they actually have, is played to Ecstasy of Gold. And I think a lot of football fans might know that song as it's attached to, I think, the Modelo commercials now. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah. Well, he wrote music. I'm reading his bio a little. 500 movies that he did at least some music for. 500! My God.
And could you believe he never really achieved, at least in terms of the Academy Awards, the number of wins that you would have expected? And I believe, I see it right here, is only a competitive Academy Award for his score in Quentin Tarantino's Hateful Eight. But that came out in 2016. You know, that's way long ago. It's just so absolutely surprising that was the case, I guess.
When they say that many movies, I wonder how many of those were reuses of his prior scores of one kind or another. So
that's a fair point.
No, he did The Untouchables, Cinema Paradiso, The Mission, Battle of Algiers, but he made a point of he was doing very traditional music in some ways, but a lot of these sounds and noises. He was apparently a big fan of John Cage, the abstract composer. He told his friends the secret of his success with the Westerns was using that coyote howl, that you know. So, yeah, Hateful Eight in 2016, but
which is such a crazy.
There's a good line. He says, "I understand and I know that a movie kind of belongs to the director. So what I do is follow him. What I think I've done is specified and made clearer what the characters were feeling."
Just absolutely incredible, and really made those pictures, I think, come to life in their own way. I was so far removed from those earlier Westerns that came out that, you know, really proliferated into Hollywood up until about the 50s, late 50s.
Oh, more than that. We just did, on the genre guys, we just did The Undefeated, which was 1960, I forget. But Dominic Frontieri, who you don't think of as a Western kind of old timer, like, well, the Newmans and that style, did a movie score that's very much that kind of thing. So, yeah, Ennio was 91 years old when he passed. And what got him? He fell down and broke his leg, and he died from the aftermath of that.
Oh, man. Rough.
He got the honorary Oscar in 2007, and then the competitive one for Hateful Eight. But
that's a shame, real shame, because man, oh man, I just his work was so legendary, and like I said, really added so much character. I guess he would say in his words, really followed the director so precisely and so beautifully that obviously Quentin Tarantino used him for Hateful Eight, but that kind of tells you the remarkable legacy that these films had. They inspired filmmakers for decades, still inspire filmmakers today.
They inspired them because, for example, with Tarantino, as much as the music itself is wonderful, he's putting in his audience's mind for Hateful Eight the emotional images of the great early spaghetti westerns. He's telling you where you're at, that you're not in the John Ford West, you're in the Sergio Leone West.
Right.
You know what I mean? So,
and I want to kind of key in on that a little bit too, because these are very distinct tones for these versions of the West, right? Because I think Sergio Leone was a self-described pessimist, if I'm not mistaken. He was very much more of a realist, and that comes from the background of what we talked about in the early part of this video.
Well, yeah, when your whole country's been destroyed,
right?
You take your wins when you can get them, and you don't assume that somebody who rides up quite literally on a white horse and says, "I'm going to save everybody," is either capable, let alone sincere. So that's the pessimism of it.
Yeah, there's more of it's more of a realist take, whereas the John Ford kind of West was everybody rides off into the sunset. Everybody's kind of happy go lucky.
Well, the good, the bad, the ugly is not about who's going to win. It's about who's going to get the money that's hidden. That's the whole reason for the film, which is this treasure of gold. in this cemetery. And that's what they're all looking for. And the good guys win, because there's not good guys. None of them really. There are different kinds of bad guys. But by the way, look it up and put it in the description someplace. There is a wonderful, wonderful documentary. I know it's on Amazon, or was, about the making of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But what it's really all about is these people who decided to go find it and dig it up. The Sad Hill Cemetery, where the whole thing takes its big finale, where that scene that Metallica uses the music, The Ecstasy of Gold, from. And it's a bunch of fans of the movie. And they sort of know where in Spain it was. And they sort of know that when it was over, they just piled dirt over it and walked away. But they're not quite sure why and where. And they get together a group of people who go out and find this set. It's not just like we said in some of the video special features, where it's, this is what it looked like then, and this is where it is, and all that. It's ostensibly kind of an archaeology movie about the movies, but what it really is about the power these things have decades after they were made and seen, and how certainly people who were not even old enough to go to the movies when they came out, but they love them because they've seen it and it struck a chord. And it just shows you, well, it's true of all good art. I mean, there's a reason why the Mona Lisa is still treasured. There's a reason why Michelangelo's David is treasured literally centuries after it was made. I mean, those statues were let's go to the movies of that era in history. Those pictures were not just look at a picture of a woman's face, but wonder what she's thinking and what's going on. And they're inspired. The artist's inspiration and skill inspires ours, even with a movie that has a very definite ending. If it's that good, you're thinking about, well, what do they do next? And where did they live? And where did they die? And what did their kids do? And because they become real. And in a way, the fact that some of that is left to your imagination by the score, by the style, by the performances, it makes you a participant, not just an observer. It makes you a part of that story, even though it, A, is fictional, and B, takes place in a time and a place that's far removed from your own. And it may be the Old West and not new Hollywood, but it's still human beings with their own hopes and dreams and desires. And if the movie is done well, you resonate with that. If it isn't, I always joke about it. There was this thing that the National Lampoon did back in must have been about the 70s, where they called it the Suddenly Everyone Was Run Over by a Truck School of Dramatic Criticism. And it postulated, if you're enjoying a movie or a book or anything, and then when you turn the page, the next line says, and suddenly everyone was run over by a truck. Do you care?
That's a fair point.
And a lot of times you sure as heck don't. And
well, and that's I think really does speak to how authentic those characters really feel, and how Sergio Leone was able to portray his characters in a way that felt a little bit more, well, I guess I just said it, more authentic than maybe the prior iterations of those Westerns felt.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point, to say that music added to a totally fictional story makes those people realer, because we're connecting with them in an emotional way that no matter how they perform and what they say,
right,
we can't to that level. It's a visceral, gut level connection. And, it's true. I mean, I got to tell you, the biggest frustration I have here on these channels discussing great movies or TV shows or whatever is that the rules of YouTube and whatever don't allow me to say, and here's the music, and listen to this and you'll feel, because so many are so good. The scores that are just, to my mind, they're integral part of the movie experience, no matter how good it is. And some of them are very obvious, okay? If you've ever seen, or even if you haven't and have heard the theme song from How the West Was Won, that's part of that show. That's part of the whole thing you think of. Certainly look at the music in Jaws, or pick a movie. Some of them are lousy, but a lot of them, it sets the scene, it sets the pace, it sets the mood. It tells you what should be important to you about what you're about to see and what you're seeing. And in some cases, that's true not just for emotion, but for comedy, certainly, for farce, for the real truth, For example, in Hitchcock, those scores often are saying something entirely different than what's happening on the screen because they're supposed to, because what's happening on the screen is not the real truth. And you find out later, that's what they were doing, And the music, next time you see it, when you watch it a second time, you find out the music was telling you all along. Powerful stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, I would dare to say that although obviously people have to talk to each other to make a story on screen, that the innovation of sound was more important with music than it was with dialogue.
That's a great point that you bring up, because that actually brings us to a question that we actually got on the comment section of one of our live streams. Go ahead and bring up right now. From Trooper Donnie, missed out on the live stream. Lou, have you done a show about the evolution of sound in the movies or the introduction of color? Now, I want to save the introduction of color.
I guess we're doing the sound one right now, whether we realized it or not, is the answer to that.
Exactly. But evolution of sound in movies, we've talked a little bit about this before with Foley and some of the other aspects, but I don't think we've ever talked about kind of the music and how that was introduced, or really, going from the silent film era to the talkies.
If you think about it, sound came to the movies before sound came to the movies. By which I mean, in the silent days, you had a guy playing the piano or something like that to add mood to the moment. And that really set the stage for the rest of it. As far as, obviously, the evolution also has to do with the amplification and stereo and we talked a little about sense around. Also, one of the things we've lost in the last 30 years used to be a movie never came out, but what the record of the soundtrack came out too. And that doesn't happen anymore. And certainly the fact that the Oscars always had a category and an award, not only for the original score of the movie, but also for a song. And that competition for the best song was largely because we lived in an era of AM radio playing songs to the point where it sometimes was blatant. There's a song called "The Theme from a Summer Place," and that's the actual name of the song. And it was a big, huge AM radio, FM radio instrumental hit. But you don't do that anymore, do we? I remember even maybe 70s, 80s, having to go, for some reason, the Japanese always did soundtracks, even when they were never released here, of American movies. Having to go to a record store in Little Tokyo, downtown LA, to find records of music I loved from movies that was never, ever, it was the soundtrack. It did come from the original recordings, but nobody ever thought it was commercial enough to put that stuff out when the record business became all rock and roll, and that's a shame. He says about introduction of color. I don't think, honestly, that made as big an impact. It certainly made pictures beautiful. But the fact that color was not that far before widescreen kind of blurs the two in my mind as far as the impact of movies because widescreen made a bigger impact. And there were so many different versions, of course. And color was, I've told the story, I think, on here before about Technicolor and how it originated, and that it was not a photographic or chemical color process like it is now. It was literally printing. It was literally 3 different filters and 3 different sheets of film going through the machine. Literally, the result for the print of the film, as opposed to the negative, was to take these and use them literally like a rubber stamp. They went through a vat of color and they got printed onto a blank piece of film. And when the 3 overlaps created the colors, that's what you had, was if you will, it was like, kind of like slides, in the sense that it's projecting through ink, not a chemical reaction that causes a certain color. Now, that made the variety of colors available, just like we all used to talk about with computers, about how many pixels and all of that. It meant that was more limited. But that also meant they were more vivid because, red was red, Yeah,
it was.
I think color had some negatives, too. I think, for one thing, there were subjects that were better in black and white than in color, that the color would have distracted from. Obviously, if it's 2 people in an apartment exploring their relationship, all right, color, fine. But Genre guys, for example, did Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which was a stage play, and the director, Mike Nichols, directing his first feature film, very adamantly wanted to do it in black and white. And the studio very adamantly did not, because they thought at that point, people were saying they weren't going to black and white pictures because they were preferring color. And in fact, the Oscars used to give out 2 cinematography awards, one for black and white and one for color. I don't know if you knew that, but it's
I didn't.
Yeah, there was quite a period there where they did, because they recognized they were different skills, both technically and creatively. But the other thing, of course, is that it led to eventually all this colorizing of black and white movies, which I've never seen one yet that really worked.
Right.
But even that goes way back in LA. I don't even know if it's still there, because there was a whole scandal about somebody getting murdered or something. But there was a place called the Silent Movie Theater on Fairfax. And they showed not just what you'd expect, which is, comedies, but serious, dramatic, black and white, silent movies. And some of them, even though they were black and white, the original prints, they would literally dye the film, for example, in the night scenes, a deep blue. Back when they were released, back in the teens, there were color films, even though there was no color photography. Wow. So obviously they felt it helped enhance the movies. Now, the whole film wasn't that way. It was just the scenes that could be done easily like that, because you had the black and white image, and then the in this case, the nighttime blue over it. So the only gradation you got was based on the black and white underneath. It wasn't like there's 3 shades of blue. There's the same shade, and it's only darker or lighter to the degree at which it's being added or subtracted to black and white. But so that idea wasn't new. But again, the question of, if you're doing a movie that's in great scenery, or even not so much scenery, what if you're doing a movie about something in the theater? Certainly all the big, wonderful musicals were certainly better in color, no doubt about it. But that's in other words, I think the success or failure is based on the subject and the tone and the style of the movie, not on, is it more realistic or is it prettier in the abstract? There's my thoughts on sound and color, but
well, no, I think it's beautiful.
To some degree, they were a
Oscars.
gimmick. To some degree, they were all a gimmick for some shows.
Sure.
As was 3D, as was Smell-O-Vision, and as was certainly widescreen. And then the really wide stuff, the 70 millimeter stuff, the Todd AO and the Super Panavision and all of those. It made it pretty difficult at the dawn of CGI, because everybody went crazy with digital everything.
Sure.
And never considered that even 1080p super duper high resolution 4K whatever, it still doesn't have as many pixels as a frame of 35 millimeter film. Now you can make that work for you or work against you. It's why you see these pictures of the making of, let's say the first Ghostbusters, and they show the miniatures with the Stay Puft Man walking down the street. You'll see a guy pumping smoke, fog into it. You know why? Because if you did it without that, it doesn't look real, even though it's really physically a thing and not a computerized image. But
Sure.
But in the real world, there is haze. In the real world, it gets darker or lighter based on the distance from the camera the background is. I guess what I'm saying is none of these things were solutions. They were new problems, which were solved. But I don't think, with the exception of a few films where they made a point of it, like, let's say Gone with the Wind, certainly, but Wizard of Oz, things like that. I don't think if you took the average, I don't know, pick a genre, World War II movie, even though black and white is more accurate. Why? Because the newsreels that came back that showed people at home what it was like were all black and white. Not because, you've seen some of these movies now where here's the actual footage in color that they took for archival purposes. It's certainly more vivid and it certainly makes things more real. But as far as the dramatic effect of whether you care more or less whether Clark Gable gets shot or whatever, I don't think so.
Well, it's really interesting because, one can make the argument, right? So Steven Spielberg, when he's making Saving Private Ryan, he desaturates that to the nth degree in order to give you that really, I think what you were talking about there, not only a gritty layer to it, but also one that is
It
a
puts
lot of
you
people
in
live
sync with how people actually experience that piece of history.
Exactly.
Even if they experience it as most people did, secondhand by way of a newsreel or a documentary or something being made after the fact.
But then you have stuff like Schindler's List, where that really does work in black and white very, very well. And there are moments of color for obviously emphasis.
And think about the fact that things that were pretty grim, if you did them in color and showed just how awful they were, people couldn't get past that. And the proof of that is great movie, but the color made it quote unquote worse for people to endure, and they reacted negatively to it. Wild Bunch. Everybody made oh my God, so much blood. Well, guess what? Black and white or color, the people still die, and the people still bleed, and the people still hurt. But maybe if you don't want your audience to be so completely distracted by that they're not getting into the other points of the picture, that's a bad thing, not a good thing, to be more realistic. So
it's Psycho.
These are, sure. Yeah.
And that was after North by Northwest. That was color.
Yeah. But how could you do with the same impact the crop duster scene or the scene at the end on Mount Rushmore in black and white? And yet, if you think about it, Rushmore is black and white. The actual thing is all gray tones, which makes the people stand out more. One of the little things you can look at, by the way, curious little color anecdote that just comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Go look at the original TV series of Mission Impossible. Remember how it started, even the first year before Graves was there. Mm-hmm. It started with he goes out to wherever it is, and they play him the tape recording, and it'll self-destruct and all of that. And then we go to his apartment where he's picking who's going to be on this mission and from the folder. And then they're all there planning it. Look at those scenes, and you will find that his apartment is almost entirely black and white. The upholstery, the paintings on the walls, everything. And that the people, the team, are almost always wearing nothing but black, white, and gray, so that the color of their faces pops against that contrasting plain backdrop. And they did that because the director, producer, and the cinematographer got together and said, that would send a message about these people. It almost says, this is the real story, and now this fiction we're going to weave to get the bad guy is a play, if you think about it, because the rest of it, of course, is in color. But go look at that and pay attention to what those color tones do to the mood of those opening scenes. And it was a choice, and a definite choice, and it ran for the whole series. And you think anybody at home was, oh, look, it's in black and white or color, but you feel it. You feel it. So now you know what to look for, but it's there.
What a fascinating discussion. What a fascinating.
Oh, I hope so.
Backlot tour of history, right?
Because if we don't make you feel like that, we're going to wind up on a lady's hat.
Uh-oh. Nice reference right there. I love that. Yeah, pay attention. It's showtime. Well, everybody, thank you so much for watching this far right here. For those of you who tuned into the live stream who came back and saw the rest of this, thank you so much for doing that. We love it. We deeply appreciate it. Hey, maybe you can actually see which parts I edited, which parts I kept. That's kind of an interesting thing too. Take you behind the scenes, not just of the movies, but of our productions as well. Thank you so much for joining us. If you like this video, please definitely go ahead and like this video. If you dislike this video, well, you can go ahead and do that too. Leave a comment in the chat as well, because we take your questions week to week. I love to bring up questions.
We're not obligated to any particular subject. The only thing, as I've said before, is that I won't get too personal about people that I know, because they're entitled to their privacy too. But in general, anything goes. And do send us some more questions. We know you've got them. Don't be shy.
Absolutely. The original email address is still available as well, t3ponline@yahoo.com. We have 2 questions in there that, yes, we will be getting to in future shows, but they're a little bit long, so I want to go ahead and give them their proper due. And I think that's
next week we'll be back to live again, because assuming I'm still alive and you're still alive, and you're all out there still alive. So
right. So we will definitely be doing a live show for sure. So regular programming as always.
And one more thing I want to say to our audience.
Please.
You folks are the cream of the crop because you really care about movies, as you know we do. Happily, I'm getting glorious reruns on this new channel out of our genre guys stuff, which is Hangry Tables and Lauren and I taking a movie and diving in. And I find when I see them come up here, because the deal is that they're members only on the Pro channel, and then a couple of months later, we do them here with some enhanced VashSky editorial like only he can do. It's fun watching them again. And my inevitable reaction is to send the other two guys a thing saying, hey, like I did just this week where Mad World came up. And I said, you know what? We were damn good on that one. That was a really good one. But I seem to be saying that every week. And it's not just because of me. It's because I forgot what I said and what they said. And so if you're a movie fan, don't let this be our only touch with you on this channel. Go look at the genre guys because they're awfully fun to do. And follow my eternal watchword. If these movies reach you, they're going to reach your kids, your grandkids, other people. Buy it. Don't let your viewing be dependent on what some streaming channel decides to do or how they choose to edit it or trigger warning it or change it. Get the real thing, stick the disc on the shelf, and every couple of years go back and say, gosh, there's nothing to watch at the movies. What the heck am I going to do tonight? And the answer is, oh, that one. Because the movie may not change, but you will have, and your reactions will be new to you as they are to this from us. Enough of soapbox, but
hey, if you're a movie fan, definitely hit the subscribe button. We have all kinds of content on a weekly basis right here. So thank you so much for watching That Park Place Podcast Online, or as we like to call it, T3PO. Please comment, like, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place for all the news that should be fun.